Picture this. It's 1875, the Kansas prairie stretches endlessly under a merciless sky, and women are nothing more than currency in a world ruled by desperate men. Isabella Henderson is about to discover that her father has made a deal that will change her life forever, a deal where she is the payment. What would you do if you woke up one morning to find out you'd been sold? Not your belongings, not your labor, but your entire future handed over to a complete stranger to settle someone else's debts? This isn't a story from some distant fantasy world. This is the brutal reality that countless women faced on the American frontier, where survival often meant sacrificing everything you held dear. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, unexpected heroes emerge from the most unlikely places. Sometimes a single act of kindness can change the course of two lives forever. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or protection, it's something far more precious, the right to choose their own destiny. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Isabella Henderson, a young woman who refused to accept the fate others had chosen for her, and Samuel Morrison, a Civil War veteran whose own scars taught him the true meaning of freedom. This is a story about courage in the face of impossible odds, about finding love when you've lost everything, and about discovering that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply choose to be free. Get ready for a journey that will take you from the depths of despair to the heights of hope, across the unforgiving Kansas plains where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, love and loneliness, freedom and a lifetime of regret. If you're ready to discover what happens when a desperate father makes an unthinkable choice and a lonely rancher offers something no one ever has, then stay with me. And if this story touches your heart the way it touched mine, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Isabella's situation. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible stories like this one. Now, let's step back in time to a cold autumn day in 1875, when Isabella Henderson's world was about to change forever. The Kansas wind howled across the barren plains like a mourning woman, carrying with it the acrid scent of dried earth, withered crops, and the bitter taste of broken dreams. Isabella Henderson clutched her threadbare woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the crooked doorway of their ramshackle cabin, watching her father pace back and forth across the warped floorboards like a caged wolf. The autumn of 1875 had been merciless to the Henderson family, stripping away their crops, their hope, and now their dignity. Winter lurked on the horizon like a predator, ready to finish what drought and the great locust swarms had started. The cabin itself seemed to sag under the weight of their misfortune. What had once been a proud homestead, modest but filled with promise, now bore the scars of 3 years of failed harvests. The roof leaked in 4 places, patched with whatever scraps of metal and wood her father could find. The windows were cracked, stuffed with old newspapers to keep out the autumn chill. The smell of mildew and desperation clung to everything like a second skin. "Isabella, come here," her father's voice cracked with exhaustion and something else. Shame, perhaps, or the kind of desperation that makes honest men consider dishonest choices. His weathered hands, once steady enough to guide a plow through the toughest soil, now trembled as he held a crumpled piece of paper. The document looked official, legal, final. "We need to talk." She approached slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor that had long since lost its varnish. At 19, Isabella had already learned that conversations beginning with those 4 words rarely ended well. Her father's eyes, once bright with the hope that had driven them to claim this piece of Kansas prairie, now held the hollow look of a man who had fought a war against the land itself and lost. John Henderson had aged a decade in the past year alone. His sandy hair, once thick and proud, had thinned to wisps that he constantly pushed back with nervous gestures. His shoulders, which had once carried 100-pound sacks of grain with ease, now curved inward as if trying to protect his heart from further assault. The man who had promised her mother on her deathbed that he would take care of their daughter now couldn't even meet that daughter's questioning gaze. "Thomas Whitmore came by today," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, unable to meet her eyes. "He's heading west with his wagon train come spring. California, maybe Oregon. Good man, they say in town. Works hard. He can provide for you in ways that—" His voice trailed off, And Isabella saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Isabella's heart began to sink like a stone thrown into a deep well. She'd heard the whispers in town, seen the way some women looked at her with pity mixed with relief that it wasn't them. Women being traded like livestock, promises made to settle debts or secure passage to new territories. Young girls promised to men old enough to be their fathers, all in the name of survival. But she'd never imagined, never dared to think that her own father would. "Father, no," she whispered, but he raised his hand to silence her, a gesture that had never been necessary before. She had always been the obedient daughter, the one who never caused trouble, who understood that life on the frontier meant sacrifice. "Listen to me, Isabella. Please." His voice broke on her name, and she could see tears threatening to spill from his red-rimmed eyes. "We owe McBride $300 for the seed that failed to grow. The bank wants $200 more for the loan on this land. Whitmore's offering a wagon, supplies, enough to get us through the winter and maybe even start again somewhere else. Without that..." He gestured helplessly at their surroundings. "Without that, we'll starve before the first snow melts." The reality hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. She wasn't just her father's daughter anymore. She was a commodity, a solution to their desperate situation. The man she'd never met, never spoken to, would own her just as surely as he owned his oxen and wagon. Her body, her future, her very soul had been bartered away for the promise of survival. Isabella looked around the cabin that had been her entire world. The kitchen table where her mother had taught her to read, using the family Bible and old newspapers. The corner where she'd played with cornhusk dolls as a child. The window where she'd watched for her father's return from the fields every evening, back when there had been hope in his step and pride in his bearing. "What about love?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. "What about choice?" Her father's face crumpled. "Love is a luxury we can't afford. Choice is something for people who have options." He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "I'm sorry, Isabella. I'm so damn sorry. If there was any other way..." But there wasn't, and they both knew it. The frontier was unforgiving to those who couldn't adapt, couldn't pay their debts, couldn't find a way to survive. Women like Isabella had few options: marriage, domestic service, or worse. At least with Whitmore she would have security, protection, a roof over her head. That night, as her father slept fitfully in his chair by the dying fire, Isabella lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. She could hear mice scurrying in the walls, the wind moaning through the gaps in the logs, and her father's troubled breathing. But beneath it all, she heard something else, the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and strong, reminding her that she was still alive, still capable of choice, even if that choice seemed impossible. She thought about her mother, dead these past 3 years from a fever that had taken her slowly, painfully. What would she have wanted for her daughter? Not this. Not to be bartered away like cattle at market. Her mother had married for love, had chosen her father when she could have had her pick of suitors back in Missouri. She had chosen the frontier, chosen hardship, chosen love over security. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the cracked window, Isabella made her decision. She rose quietly, her bare feet finding the familiar creaks and groans of the old floorboards. She packed what little she owned into a small bundle, her mother's worn Bible with its faded ribbon bookmark, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, and the few coins she'd saved from selling eggs in town, barely enough to buy a meal, but all she had. She paused at her father's chair, watching him sleep. In the gray morning light, he looked fragile, broken. She wanted to wake him, to tell him she understood, that she forgave him. But she also knew that if she spoke to him now, her resolve might crumble. Instead, she leaned down and kissed his forehead gently, tasting the salt of tears she hadn't realized she was crying. The moon was new, a dark blessing that offered her the cover of darkness she needed. She slipped out into the cold Kansas night, her heart pounding with each step that took her farther from the only home she'd ever known. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, dangerous and unforgiving, filled with wild animals, harsh weather, and men who might be worse than either. But somehow, it seemed less frightening than the alternative waiting for her at dawn, A life without choice, without love, without hope. Behind her, the cabin grew smaller and smaller until it was just another dark shape on the horizon. Ahead lay the unknown, terrifying and vast. But for the first time in her life, Isabella Henderson was walking towards something she had chosen for herself, even if that choice was simply the right to choose her own fate, whatever that might be. Isabella stumbled through the darkness for what felt like an eternity, her feet bleeding inside her worn leather boots, the cold night air cutting through her thin shawl like a knife. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound made her heart race with the fear that her father had awakened and discovered her absence. The prairie at night was a different world entirely, alive with the calls of coyotes in the distance, the rustle of unseen creatures in the tall grass, and the endless whisper of wind that seemed to carry voices from another realm. Her legs trembled with exhaustion when she finally saw it. A faint, warm glow of lantern light in the distance, like a beacon of hope in the vast darkness. As dawn began to break over the plains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Isabella found herself at the edge of a modest ranch that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself like something from a dream. The property was a stark contrast to her family's failing homestead. The house was small but solid, built from sturdy logs chinked with care and attention to detail. The roof showed no signs of repair or patching, and the windows gleamed clean in the morning light. A well-maintained barn stood nearby, its red paint still vibrant despite the harsh Kansas weather. The corral was constructed with straight, strong posts and tight wire, housing several horses that nickered softly at her approach. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work despite living alone, who found purpose in the daily ritual of caring for his land and animals. Isabella's strength finally gave out near the stone-lined well, and she collapsed onto the hard-packed earth, her body unable to carry her another step. The morning sun was rising rapidly, and she knew that soon her father would discover her absence. Panic mixed with exhaustion as she realized she had nowhere else to go, no plan beyond the desperate need to escape the fate that had been chosen for her. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up with startled eyes to see a man silhouetted against the morning sun. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that spoke of years of hard physical work rather than mere natural advantage. His hair was prematurely gray, silver threads that caught the light and suggested experiences far beyond his apparent age. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, deep blue-gray like storm clouds, holding depths of experience and pain that she couldn't begin to fathom. "Miss? Are you hurt?" His voice was gentle, careful, as if he knew instinctively how easily frightened creatures could be startled into flight. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, like a man who had learned to read the signs of fear and trauma in others. Samuel Morrison had been living alone on his ranch for 3 years, ever since he'd returned from the war that had stolen his youth and left him with nightmares that still visited on quiet nights when the wind howled too much like cannon fire. He'd chosen isolation not out of misanthropy, but out of a deep understanding that some wounds needed silence to heal. He found peace in the rhythm of daily chores, feeding the cattle, mending fences, tending to his small vegetable garden, and in the honest work of raising livestock that asked nothing of him but care and consistency. The sight of the young woman collapsed by his well stirred something in Samuel that he'd thought long buried. She was clearly exhausted, her dark hair tangled and wild, her dress torn and stained from her journey across the rough terrain. But there was something in her posture, even in her weakness, that spoke of dignity and determination rather than mere desperation. "I'm sorry," Isabella managed to say, struggling to stand on unsteady legs. "I didn't mean to trespass. I needed—" Her voice trailed off as she realized how impossible it was to explain her situation to a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes might seem. "You needed shelter," Samuel finished quietly, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "And by the looks of it, food and rest too." He extended his hand to help her up, noting how she flinched at the gesture, a reaction he recognized all too well from his own early days back from the war. "I'm Samuel Morrison. This is my land." Isabella hesitated before taking his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentle strength that belied his careful approach. "Isabella Henderson. I was running from something I couldn't face. Samuel nodded as if this explanation was not only sufficient but expected. In his years of solitude, he'd learned that everyone was running from something, whether it was the memory of battlefields, the weight of expectations, or the kind of desperation that drove young women to flee into the night. He didn't need details to recognize the look of someone who had reached the end of their rope and found the courage to cut it rather than hang. He led her toward the house, noting how she kept glancing over her shoulder like a rabbit ready to bolt at the first sign of pursuit. The inside of Samuel's home was as well maintained as the exterior, clean and organized with the precision of a man who had learned to find comfort in order. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and a simple wooden table surrounded by 2 chairs. Everything was functional rather than decorative, but there was a warmth to it that spoke of a man who had created a home rather than merely a shelter. "There's a room in the back," he said, opening a door to reveal a simple but clean space with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a wash basin on a wooden stand, and a small window that looked out over the corral. "You can stay as long as you need. No questions asked." Isabella stared at him in disbelief, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. In her experience, men always wanted something: work, obedience, or worse. The idea that this stranger would offer her sanctuary without conditions seemed too good to be true, too dangerous to accept. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could be a thief or worse. I could bring trouble to your door." A ghost of a smile crossed Samuel's weathered face, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "Could be. But I've seen real danger, miss, and you're not it. You're just someone who needs a safe place to figure out what comes next." He paused, his gaze growing distant for a moment as if remembering something from long ago. War teaches you to recognize different kinds of threats. It also teaches you to recognize when someone needs help, no questions asked. "I've been where you are, maybe not the same circumstances, but that same feeling of having nowhere else to turn." Isabella felt tears threatening to spill over, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of his offer. "I don't have money to pay you. I don't have anything to offer in return." "Not asking for anything," Samuel replied simply. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is give them space to breathe, to think, to decide what they want to do next. Consider this that space." For the first time in her life, Isabella felt what it meant to be offered choice without conditions. No promises to make, no debts to pay, no expectations to meet. Just sanctuary, freely given by a man who seemed to understand that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the right to exist without justification. As she stood in the doorway of the small room that he was offering her, Isabella realized that she had stumbled upon something rarer than gold in the harsh world of the frontier, a man who had learned to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. It was a lesson that would change everything she thought she knew about what it meant to be free. 2 weeks had passed since Isabella's arrival, and she'd fallen into a routine that felt both foreign and natural. Samuel asked nothing of her except to make herself at home, but she found herself helping with small tasks around the ranch, cooking, mending, tending to the chickens he kept behind the barn. They spoke little during the day, but their silences were comfortable rather than awkward. Isabella learned that Samuel had served in the Union Army, that he'd lost friends in battles whose names he rarely spoke aloud. She understood that his solitude wasn't just preference, it was protection against memories that could still catch him off guard. On a particularly cold morning, Isabella was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized her father's hunched figure alongside a larger man she assumed was Thomas Whitmore. Behind them rode 2 other men, their faces hard with determination. "Samuel," she called, running toward the house. He emerged from the barn, took one look at her face, and immediately understood. "Go inside," he said calmly. "Stay away from the windows." Isabella watched through a crack in the curtains as Samuel walked out to meet the men. Her father dismounted first, his face a mixture of relief and anger. "There she is," Thomas Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the yard. He was a large man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to inventory everything they saw. "Isabella Henderson. We had an agreement." With her father, Not with her, Samuel replied evenly. And she's not on your land. Whitmore's face darkened. She's promised to me. Bought and paid for. Her father owes debts that my wagon and supplies will cover. Then take your wagon and supplies back, Samuel said. The woman stays here by her own choice. Isabella's heart pounded as she watched the confrontation unfold. Her father looked defeated, caught between his desperation and his daughter's defiance. The other men shifted restlessly, hands moving closer to their weapons. You don't understand how things work out here, Whitmore said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. A man's word is his bond. An agreement is an agreement. Samuel stepped forward, and Isabella saw something in his posture that spoke of old battles fought and won. I understand perfectly. I also understand that no one leaves this ranch against their will. Not while I'm breathing. The tension stretched taut as wire until her father finally spoke. Isabella, please. Come home. We can work something out. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, her voice trembling but clear. I am home, Father. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I choose to be. The confrontation with Whitmore and her father had ended 3 days ago, but the weight of it still hung over the ranch like storm clouds that refused to break. Isabella found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, the creak of settling wood, the call of a hawk overhead, the distant thunder of cattle moving across the range. She knew it was far from over. Men like Thomas Whitmore didn't give up easily, especially when they felt cheated out of what they considered rightfully theirs. Samuel had made a dangerous enemy, and it was all because of her. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing hour. She watched Samuel go about his daily routines, checking the fence lines, tending to the pregnant mare, repairing a section of the barn roof, and saw the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He was a man preparing for war, and she was the cause of it. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the main room of the house, Isabella finally found the courage to voice the question that had been haunting her since Whitmore's departure. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside, the wind moaned through the eaves like something lost and searching. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know anything about me, about what I might bring to your door. About what I have brought to your door. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. His eyes were fixed on the flames, but Isabella could tell he was seeing something else entirely, memories that lived behind his eyes like unwelcome guests. During the war, he began slowly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain, I saw what happened when people had no choices. When they were treated like property instead of human beings. He paused, setting down his cup with careful precision. Saw plantation owners who thought they owned other people's souls. Saw soldiers who treated captured women like spoils of war. Saw men in my own unit who forgot that uniform don't make you decent. Isabella remained silent, sensing that this was a story Samuel rarely told, perhaps had never told to another living soul. There was a family, he continued, his voice growing quieter, near Atlanta, during the march. Plantation family, white folks, but that didn't matter to some of the men in my company. The war had made them hard, made them think that anything they could take was theirs by right. His hands clenched unconsciously. The father was dead, killed at Chickamauga. Just a mother and her 2 daughters left, trying to survive in a world that had gone mad around them. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney, but neither Samuel nor Isabella moved. The weight of his words filled the space between them. I tried to stop it, Samuel said, his voice barely audible now. Pulled rank, threatened court-martial, even drew my weapon on my own men. But there were too many of them and they were too far gone. By the time I got help. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes, understanding now the source of the pain she sometimes glimpsed in Samuel's expression, the reason he had chosen solitude over the company of his fellow men. I swore that day, Samuel continued, finally looking at her directly, that if I survived the war, I'd never stand by and watch it happen again. Never let someone with power hurt someone without it, not if I could help it. Some things are worth the risk, worth fighting for. Your freedom is one of them. Isabella stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was telling her. This man had risked everything. His safety, his peace, his carefully constructed solitude, for a stranger, simply because it was the right thing to do. But you've built a peaceful life here, she said, gesturing around the comfortable room they shared. I've brought trouble to your door. Whitmore won't forget this. He'll be back, and next time he might bring more men. Probably, Samuel agreed with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. But some things are worth the risk. Your freedom is one of them. My peace of mind is another. Isabella felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. I don't know how to be free, she whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. I've never been allowed to choose anything for myself. I don't even know who I am when I'm not trying to please someone else or avoid someone else's anger. Samuel leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. Then you'll learn, he said simply. One day at a time. One choice at a time. Freedom isn't something you get all at once, it's something you practice, like learning to ride a horse or play the piano. Over the following weeks, as winter settled over the Kansas plains with a vengeance, Isabella began to understand what Samuel meant. Freedom, she discovered, wasn't just the absence of constraint, it was the presence of choice, made fresh each morning. She chose when to rise with the sun or sleep until the light streaming through her window made staying in bed impossible. She chose what to cook for their meals, experimenting with recipes she remembered from her mother and inventing new ones from the supplies Samuel kept in his well-stocked pantry. She chose how to spend her afternoons, sometimes helping with ranch work, sometimes reading from Samuel's small but carefully chosen library, sometimes simply sitting on the porch and watching the vast sky change color as clouds moved across it like ships on an endless sea. But freedom came with responsibility, and Isabella learned this lesson when Samuel fell ill with a fever that struck sudden and hard, leaving him weak and disoriented. She chose to stay by his side through the worst of it, cooling his burning forehead with damp cloths, forcing liquid down his throat when he could barely keep his eyes open, and sitting vigil through the long nights when his breathing became labored and she feared she might lose the first person who had ever offered her unconditional kindness. For 3 days and nights, Isabella barely left Samuel's side. She discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, finding ways to lift his much larger frame when he needed to be moved, learning to read the signs of his condition and adjust her care accordingly. When his fever finally broke on the 4th morning, she was exhausted but triumphant, and Samuel's first coherent words were to thank her for a kindness she felt was inadequate repayment for what he had given her. When supply wagons came through in late December, Isabella chose to help Samuel negotiate better prices for his cattle, using skills she'd learned from watching her father conduct business and discovering she had a head for numbers and a talent for reading people's intentions. The wagon master, initially dismissive of her presence, found himself agreeing to terms more favorable than he'd planned, and Samuel's approving smile was worth more to her than any wage. When winter storms threatened to trap them for days at a time, Isabella chose to work alongside Samuel to protect their home and livelihood. Together, they moved the cattle to sheltered areas, secured the barn against the wind, and ensured they had adequate supplies of food and fuel to last through the worst weather. The work was hard and sometimes dangerous, but it was work she chose to do, and that made all the difference. Spring arrived early that year, with news carried by the first traveling merchant who'd been able to get through the muddy roads. Thomas Whitmore, the man had heard in town, had died in a river crossing gone wrong while trying to ford the swollen Smoky Hill River. His wagon train had been delayed by winter storms, and when the spring thaw came, Whitmore had been impatient to make up lost time. The river had been running high and fast, and his heavy wagon had been swept away, taking him with it. Isabella felt no joy in the news, only a quiet relief that one threat had passed. Death was too common on the frontier to celebrate, even when it removed a source of fear from her life. But as she stood in the doorway of what had truly become her home, she realized she was no longer the frightened girl who had fled into the night. She had become someone who could face whatever came next with courage born of choice rather than desperation. Samuel joined her in the doorway, his health fully restored and his eyes holding something she'd never seen before, contentment mixed with something warmer, something that made her heart beat faster when she caught him looking at her with that particular expression. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying undertones of a deeper question than the simple word implied. Isabella looked out over the land they'd worked together through the long winter, the life they'd built choice by choice, day by day. The morning sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and green, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle and the song of meadowlarks welcoming the spring. This was her world now, the world she'd chosen for herself and helped to create. "None," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, smell the familiar scent of soap and leather and honest work that had come to mean safety to her. "Isabella," he said, her name soft on his lips, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you choose, it won't change anything between us. You'll always have a home here, always have a choice." She turned to face him fully, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "These past months," he continued, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "working together, building something together, I've come to care for you. More than care for you. I love you, Isabella. Not because I think I own you or because I expect anything from you, but because of who you are when you're free to be yourself." Isabella felt tears blur her vision, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Samuel," she whispered. "I'm asking," he said, reaching out to take her hands in his calloused ones, "if you might consider marrying me. Not because you owe me anything or because you need protection, but because you want to. Because you choose to. Because maybe you love me too." Isabella looked into his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had been the first to see her as a person rather than property, and realized that this was what love was supposed to feel like, not the desperate need to please or the fear of abandonment, but the joy of choosing to share your life with someone who would never ask you to be anything other than yourself. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear, carrying across the prairie like a promise. "I choose yes. I choose you. I choose us." The Kansas wind still howled across the plains, but now it carried the scent of possibility rather than desperation. Isabella Henderson had learned that freedom wasn't something given, it was something chosen, again and again, by those brave enough to claim it. And she had learned something else too, that the greatest freedom of all was the freedom to love and be loved in return, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. As Samuel kissed her there in the doorway of their home, with the morning sun warming their faces and the endless sky stretching out above them, Isabella knew that she had finally found what she'd been searching for without even knowing it, a place where she could be fully, completely, authentically herself. Free. The end.